So you're thinking about a pretty big career change, maybe even shooting for the top job at a college or vocational school.
Sounds like it. Becoming a head of higher education, sometimes it's a president or provost, depends on the institution.
Right, depends on the place.
But yeah, no walk in the park, that's for sure. But the materials you sent over, looks like you're really drawn to a challenge.
And you've got to be up for a challenge with this kind of role, right?
Absolutely. Passion is key, for sure. But there's this career guide from RoleCatcher you shared.
Yeah, this one seemed really interesting.
It really highlights that it takes more than just, loving to learn. We're talking leadership, management, thinking strategically, even navigating, the world of academic politics, which can be a little
I'll bet.
tricky.
Okay, so let's dive into this guide. It seems like a gold mine, honestly lays out the whole career path, from entry level all the way to the head honcho's chair.
Yeah. Even breaks down the typical stuff you'd be doing at each stage, which I thought was really helpful.
It's almost like a roadmap.
Yeah, exactly, like a roadmap. And they have these example profiles, too, which I really liked. You can see, like, how someone might start as a junior admin, get some experience in different areas, admissions, maybe curriculum development.
Right, get your feet wet.
Then move up to senior
Work
admin.
your way up.
And then finally, go for the gold.
It makes it feel more real,
Yeah.
Instead of just a list of skills, you see how an actual person climbed the ladder. Speaking of skills, the guide goes into managing day-to-day activities. And I got to say, that sounds pretty intense when you're running an entire institution. What does that even look like in practice?
It's like juggling, honestly. You're overseeing everything, academic programs, how the money's being handled, making sure those student services are running smoothly.
Right, because there's a lot riding on that.
And, of course, the head's got to stay on top of those national education standards.
Oh, for sure.
And accreditation, which can get really specific depending on, what kind of institution it is and what programs they offer.
That's a ton of responsibility. And it's not just about checking things off a list either, right? The guide also talks about the human side of things, building relationships with faculty, staff, even alumni and people in the community.
Oh, totally. That's where those leadership and communication skills are absolutely essential.
Totally. You can't just be a manager. You got to be a leader.
You've got faculty, staff, students, parents, alumni.
Stakeholders everywhere.
Even community leaders, all these different perspectives and priorities. Sometimes they clash. You got to be able to navigate that whole web.
Talk about a people person. And speaking of challenges, the guide doesn't try to sugarcoat things either. Long hours, high stress, even potential conflicts like within the education sector itself. What really jumped out at you as particularly, daunting?
Well, it's definitely not an easy job, that much is clear. But, I think what really struck me is the pressure on higher ed these days to keep up with the job market.
Oh, absolutely. It's not like the old days where you get a degree and that's it, you're set for life.
Right.
It's about giving students the actual skills to make it in the real world, which is changing all the time.
All the time. And speaking of changing all the time, we can't forget about technology.
The elephant in the room. It's completely transforming how education works.
Totally. And the guide really stresses that leaders, they can't be afraid of technology. You gotta be on top of the latest, integrate it into the programs, even make sure your institution can actually support it, infrastructure-wise.
Right, which brings up a ton of other questions like how much online learning is too much? What about things like virtual labs, simulations?
That's a whole other layer.
It gets complicated.
It really does. And it made me think about something else the guide said about continuous learning.
Keeping up with the times.
Like even as a head, you got to keep learning, developing professionally. Can't be afraid to change, to learn new stuff all the time.
What's that saying? A growth mindset.
Exactly.
It's not just for students anymore. Leaders need it too, especially in higher ed. And, it's funny you mentioned technology because this RoleCatcher platform, it's a perfect example of how tech is changing the career game itself. We were just talking about RoleCatcher and their AI tools for your career. Pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, it's wild.
But let's bring it back to this head of higher ed role. The guy talks a lot about leadership, obviously. So what kind of leader do you see yourself being in that kind of setting?
That's the question, isn't it? It mentions faculty and staff development, but I feel like it doesn't really get into the weeds on, different leadership styles. Like what actually builds a good environment, for everyone to grow.
Right, because it's one thing to manage people, but it's another thing entirely to actually help them grow and get them on board with a shared vision, right?
Exactly. It's more like coaching almost than just being the boss.
Totally.
Like, think about it. You can delegate tasks, or you can empower your team to really own their work, bring their own strengths to the table.
The big difference.
Huge. Ahead of higher ed, they need to create that environment where everyone feels valued, like they can do their best work, you know?
Absolutely. Now that you mention it, the guy did say something about how head of higher ed wears a lot of hats.
Oh, yeah.
You're a leader, a manager, a mentor.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking about communication styles. That's got to be huge in a role like this, right? You're dealing with so many different people.
Oh, for sure. And it's not just about, like, being a good speaker, although that helps.
Of course.
It's about communicating effectively everywhere, different channels, different audiences, within the institution, outside the institution.
So you're talking about building those relationships we talked about, but also advocating for the needs of the school, maybe even navigating like disagreements, political stuff.
Exactly. And let's not forget those tough conversations, budget cuts, student issues, maybe even conflict between faculty members. It's going to happen.
Oh, I'm sure.
A head of higher ed has to be able to deal with all that and do it gracefully, diplomatically.
Which makes me wonder, are there like certain approaches to conflict resolution that work better in academia? Because it's already a place where people are, debating challenging ideas.
That's such a good point. And it made me think about self-awareness, honestly.
Oh, interesting.
Like, knowing yourself is crucial for this role. Are you someone who naturally tries to collaborate, find consensus? Or are you more decisive, more directive? Especially when things get tough.
I can see how knowing your own strengths and weaknesses there would be huge.
Absolutely. You don't want to be caught off guard when a conflict pops up.
For sure.
And even beyond specific tactics, I think just being genuine is so important.
Authenticity.
Yeah, people can spot a fake a mile away, especially in higher ed. That world really values honesty.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about the skills, the challenges, knowing yourself, being a good communicator. But I want to switch gears for a sec, get a little more personal. What are your whys for wanting to do this? What kind of legacy are you hoping to build in higher ed?
That's a big one. It's easy to get lost in the day-to-day, and forget about the bigger picture. The guide mentions making a lasting impact.
Right.
But that can mean a lot of things. What does it mean to you, I wonder?
We were just talking about making a real impact, and it got me thinking about something you mentioned earlier, making education more accessible. Yeah. That feels super relevant these days, especially with, tuition costs going up and all the talk about student debt.
Yeah, it's a huge issue for sure. And you're right, it's bigger than just like balancing the budget. Although the guide is right, that's a big part of the job for sure.
Right, got to keep the lights on.
Exactly.
So how do you bridge that gap then? Make education more affordable, but without like sacrificing quality or bankrupting the place. What are your thoughts on that?
That is the million-dollar question. It takes creativity, for sure, exploring all sorts of different options. The guide mentions things like scholarships, which is great.
Right, more scholarships.
But there could be other funding models too, Maybe even pushing for policy changes at the state level, even national.
Now you're thinking big.
Gotta be bold.
Like you're not just an administrator anymore, you're an advocate fighting for change.
Exactly.
Which I imagine could be both exciting and totally overwhelming.
Oh, for sure. You'd need to really understand everything that impacts higher ed, the economics, the politics, all the way society's changing.
A lot.
And then you got to build coalitions, influence the right people, and get them on board with your vision.
Sounds like you need another degree just to prep for this one. But seriously, it makes you realize how much the role itself is changing. We talked about technology before, and I wonder if that's part of the solution for these big picture challenges.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about like having the coolest gadgets in the classroom. It's about using tech to find completely new solutions.
Okay, so like what? Give me an example.
Well, think about online learning. That could be huge for reaching people who wouldn't normally have access,
Right, breaking down barriers.
Or AI. Imagine AI that personalizes learning for each student so you don't need expensive tutors, things like that.
Wow, that's thinking way outside the box.
It has to be.
It's not just about keeping up anymore. It's about looking ahead.
Anticipating what's coming next.
And making sure your institution is ready to not just survive,
Yeah.
but really thrive in that future.
Exactly. It's about being a visionary, someone who challenges how things are done, asks the tough questions.
Not afraid to shake things up a little bit.
Exactly. It's tough, no doubt, but for the right person, it's a chance to make a real difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I hope you're walking away with a better sense of what it really means to be a head of higher education. It's about leadership. It's about managing. It's about being open to new ideas, always learning, always growing.
And don't forget about looking inward, too.
Right, knowing yourself.
Really take the time to understand why you want this, what you're good at, what kind of leader you are.
Self-awareness is key.
Huge. It'll be so important as you navigate this whole, crazy and exciting and challenging, but ultimately really rewarding career path.
Well said. This deep dive has given you a lot to ponder, but remember, this is just the beginning. Keep asking those tough questions, keep dreaming big about the impact you want to have, and never stop learning.